One night, after spending many days in the same room as Robert, I was woken by his painful groans. "Robert, hang in there." With a panic of worry and anxiety, I kept calling his name, but there was no change in his condition. I hastily called an ambulance. "I need to inform Susan as well." I hurried to Susan's room. "Susan, wake up. Robert's in a lot of pain." However, Susan was fast asleep. Since I couldn't delay its departure, I went with Robert, leaving Susan behind. It was a subarachnoid hemorrhage. And sadly, despite all efforts, Robert passed away without regaining consciousness. At least he didn't have to pass away alone, and that was my one small comfort after all the kindness he had shown me. Upon hearing the news of Robert's passing, Susan hurried over in a panic. She stood there, expressionless, almost like a statue. It was understandable. The sorrow of losing a partner after so many years together is unimaginable. At that moment, I couldn't think of the right words to say. After gathering my thoughts, I managed to say, "Robert fought hard until the end. He has such a peaceful expression." It was right after I said that.
People's lives end so easily, don't they?
Amazingly, instead of grieving, Susan burst into loud laughter. "My name is Catherine. I've been married to my husband, Bill, for over 20 years, and now we're both in our 50s, but we don't have any children. It's not that we didn't want kids, but despite our hopes, we were never able to have them, and I went through many years feeling down."
Even if we don't have kids, let's enjoy our life together.
Seeing me struggle, Bill would say this to encourage me and support me. I know he also must have wanted children, but he was always there, sharing my pain, being so kind. About 10 years ago, we started living with Bill's elderly parents, Robert and Susan. However, a few years back, Bill had to move overseas for work, and now he only comes home a few times a year. So in reality, it's mostly just me living with his parents. Susan doesn't seem to like me much and often treats me harshly. When Bill and I first got married, I didn't really notice it. Even if we visited her a few times a year, she'd act perfectly normal. I wanted to keep a good relationship, so I always made sure to give her birthday presents and did my best to act as the perfect daughter-in-law. But over the years, her attitude started to change. She'd snap at me over small things and started commenting on every little detail. One reason for Susan's behavior is probably that we don't have children. She's always wanted grandchildren, and for years after we got married, she'd ask for them whenever we'd meet. But when it became clear that we wouldn't have kids, her kindness and patience began to fade away bit by bit. It's been a long time since we decided to live child-free, but I still carry some guilt about not being able to give her a grandchild. Because of that, I can't really bring myself to argue with her, so I just accept whatever she says without pushing back. I'm sure today will be the same. Comments about the taste of the food, the cleanliness, or something else unfair that just comes to mind. After all these years, I still feel annoyed right after she says something, but I've learned to get used to it with time. Robert used to work as a carpenter. He's a very laid-back yet responsible person with sharp, straightforward eyes that look a lot like Bill's. Well respected among his coworkers, he was still going to job sites and working energetically every day, even into his 70s. However, 7 years ago, he had an unfortunate accident where he missed his footing and fell from a high place while on his jobs. Luckily, his life wasn't in danger, but he injured his back and was admitted to the hospital. Despite treatment and rehabilitation, he was left unable to move his lower body, meaning he now needs caregiving to live day to day. Soon after Robert was hospitalized, I quit my part-time job to become a full-time homemaker, focusing on preparing for his care and visiting him in the hospital. I was worried about him and didn't want him to feel lonely, so I made time to visit him almost every day. Susan seemed shaken by the suddenness of it all. While I handled things at home, she often looked busy or was out of the house during the day. She must have been very worried about Robert.
Thanks for coming today, even though you're busy. Seeing you really lifts my spirits, Catherine.
Robert would greet me with a warm smile every day, always considerate of me. Since my visits were usually short and a bit hurried, I felt bad for him. But seeing him also reassured me and lifted my own spirits. Today, I finished up my housework early and had more time than usual. I'd be able to visit him a little longer. After preparing a meal for Susan, who had been staying in her room, I quickly got ready and headed to the hospital. Robert, how are you feeling today? I brought your favorite Swiss roll cake, so let's enjoy it together. Seeing his favorite dessert made Robert smile with delight.
You came by quite early today.
We chatted about little things while enjoying the Swiss roll together. I glanced at the clock. It was about time for Susan to visit. It should be around the time Susan usually stops by, right? At this, Robert's eyes widened.
Susan's coming to visit?
He asked, his voice bright with surprise. Robert, you must be looking forward to seeing her. What do you two usually talk about?
Susan came by the day after I was admitted, but she only stayed a moment, dropping off some things and then hurried out. She hasn't been by since, so she must be busy preparing for my care. Sorry to put her through all that trouble.
Not at all. The house is well prepared, so please feel at ease and focus on getting better. She did say it's been hard work, right? I replied this way, though I was a bit puzzled and tried not to show it.
Yeah, she mentioned something about getting things ready. Let her know that, when she has time, I'd love her to visit. I'd like to chat slowly, maybe as a bit of an apology for the trouble I've caused.
With a slightly shy smile, Robert asked me to pass on the message. Got it. Next time, I'll send her with a Swiss roll for you both to enjoy. Take care. With that, I left his room. I felt uneasy about Robert's words, wondering why Susan hadn't been coming, and I returned home with these questions in mind. Susan doesn't really bother with preparing for his care. I've been handling all of it. And she hasn't visited him at all. For now, I'll pass on Robert's message and try to subtly find out where she's been going. A little while after I got home, Susan returned. Hi, Susan. Robert seemed really eager to see you. I mentioned it, but she didn't respond. Did she not hear me? I tried again.
I'm too busy to be going over there. Besides, the hospital takes care of him, so there's no need for me to visit.
But her answer, in a cold, irritated tone, was detached and dismissive. Not wanting to upset her further, I couldn't bring myself to say anything more, and I let the matter drop. After a while, Robert finished the necessary treatments at the hospital, and it was decided he would be discharged. The day before his discharge, Susan said,
Since you'll be home all day after Robert is discharged, we won't need a helper, right?
I was stunned. She was assuming I'd take on all the caregiving without question. During his hospital stay, she hardly visited, and now she has no intention of helping with his care. Since Robert's caregiving began, Susan has shifted all the housework and care responsibilities onto me. On top of that, Susan continued to complain about my cleaning and cooking, even more than before. Even with caregiving, she keeps criticizing, saying my approach isn't right, or that it's unfair to him. Hearing so much from her gets exhausting, so before I reach my limit, I regularly call Bill to talk things over. He listens to everything on the phone, fully understanding, and often expresses his frustration even more strongly than I do. When he comes back every 3 months or so, he helps with the housework and caregiving, which fills me with relief. Bill also talks to Susan, telling her to go easier on me. Though she appears upset after being scolded by her son, it seems more like a show because she's unfazed. After Bill leaves, she often takes out her frustration on me even more harshly, repeating this cycle many times. For 7 years now, despite Susan's constant criticisms, I've managed to keep up with cooking, cleaning, laundry, and all other housework, along with Robert's care, every single day. Even with that lifestyle, I rarely found caregiving to be burdensome. I think that's thanks to Robert's warm personality. Since the beginning of our marriage, Robert has treated me like a true daughter, giving me birthday gifts and always complimenting my cooking. He has shown such care for me, sometimes listening to my small complaints or worries, and offering support and encouragement. He was a truly reassuring presence. I had always felt deep gratitude towards such a kind Robert, wondering how I could give something back, when suddenly, caregiving became part of our lives. In whatever way I could, I wanted to express my gratitude to Robert for everything he had done. Robert can't move his lower body due to his back injury. He needs help with things like using the bathroom, bathing, and moving around, but he still has full use of his upper body and can feed himself. Other than his lower body, he has no lasting physical issues, and his mind and speech are just as sharp as they always were. Because of that, we could continue chatting and even joking, making caregiving a pleasant experience. Once a week, Bill and I would video call him, where we'd share updates and enjoy chatting together, all three of us. Recently, we got excited talking about places we'd like to visit overseas. We chatted at length about what kinds of scenery we'd like to see, local foods to try, and which traditional outfits we'd love to see up close, sharing a dreamy conversation. It's amazing that at 81, Robert uses a tablet so skillfully. During the call, he would look up photos and information on the places we discussed and show me, even sharing his screen so Bill could see too. One ordinary day, as usual, I woke up and went to the living room, where I noticed a faint, unpleasant smell. To identify the source of the odor, I followed the scent. It led me to the yard, where there was a small storage shed. In the yard, used adult diapers that I had bagged were scattered everywhere. I always place the used adult diapers from caregiving into sealed bags and keep them in a locked shed until trash collection day. So, even if crows or cats got into the yard, there's no way they could have taken them out. If it wasn't crows or cats, could it have been a thief? The key is kept safely inside the house, and there were no signs of forced entry, with the key still in its place. Suddenly, I recalled something from yesterday, and a feeling of suspicion crept in. During our long video call with Bill, the door to the room was slightly open. At one point, I felt a gaze, and when I looked over, I saw Susan standing outside the door. Thinking she might be interested, I invited her to join our call, but she just glared and walked away without saying a word. She probably didn't like seeing us having such a good time without her. Could she have scattered the diapers out of spite? Since breakfast time was approaching, I quickly prepared a meal for Robert and handed it to him before heading to the yard to clean up. It was a terrible sight, but after gathering everything and spraying down the area, the smell faded and the yard returned to its usual state. This time, I tied the bags even more securely. With the yard restored, I figured Robert had probably finished his breakfast, so I went to clear his dishes. To my surprise, there were no dishes in sight and no sign that he had eaten at all. I'm sure I brought him his meal. Confused, I asked Robert what had happened to the plate.
Susan took it, saying she'd reheat it.
It had been a while, but she hadn't returned it. Hurrying to the kitchen, I was shocked by what I saw. The meal I had prepared for Robert had been thrown into the sink, looking like leftover scraps. Even I was reaching my breaking point with the relentless, unreasonable actions. I searched for Susan, but she was nowhere to be found. Her usual bag and shoes were gone, so she must have left while I was busy cleaning the yard. Having no choice, I waited for her to return. It was well past noon when Susan finally returned home. She seemed in a great mood, humming to herself. Still unable to calm my anger, I confronted her as soon as I saw her. "Did you scatter the diapers in the yard and throw away Robert's breakfast?"
Who else would do it but me? Is that a problem?
She replied, without a hint of remorse. "That's awful. If you have something to say, why can't you tell me directly?" I usually kept my feelings to myself, but this time I couldn't hold back. After a brief pause, Susan spoke up.
Everything you do just infuriates me. Even your very presence. You don't belong here at all.
Susan screamed in anger, then stormed into our bedroom. Feeling fearful about what she might do, I chased after her, only to find my belongings tossed out into the hallway. My clothes and cosmetics were scattered in disarray. Not stopping there, she shouted at me.
From today on, don't step a foot in this room. If you want to sleep, do it in the hallway.
Her room was right next door. Even if I tried to sneak back in after she'd gone to sleep, she would probably notice immediately. Besides, if I defied her, who knows what she might do next? I decided to quietly follow her instructions. But it was winter, and I knew I could get seriously sick sleeping in the hallway. Has Susan completely lost her mind? Not wanting to risk my health, I reluctantly moved a mattress into Robert's room and decided to sleep there instead. It seemed that Robert had overheard the argument between Susan and me and was deeply concerned for my well-being. "With you in the same room, it'll be easier to help you get to the bathroom, so this actually works out perfectly." To reassure Robert, I kept a cheerful tone. Since I had already been helping him with bathroom trips at night, it actually worked out well for me too. One night, after spending many days in the same room as Robert, I was woken by his painful groans. "Robert, hang in there." I called out to him, but he was holding his head in agony and couldn't respond. In a panic, I dialed for an ambulance. Full of worry and urgency, I kept calling his name, but there was no change in his condition. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly. I faintly heard the sound of the siren approaching and then stopping in front of our house. I rushed to open the door, explained the situation to the paramedics, and entrusted Robert to their care. I need to inform Susan as well. I hurried to Susan's room. Susan, wake up. Robert's in a lot of pain. However, Susan was fast asleep. The ambulance was ready to go, but Susan still wouldn't wake up. Since I couldn't delay its departure, I went with Robert, leaving Susan behind. Robert was quickly taken to the hospital and underwent various tests. The sudden severe headache was diagnosed as a subarachnoid hemorrhage. By the next morning, though his condition had stabilized, he still hadn't regained consciousness. I explained the situation to Susan, who hadn't come to the hospital, but she showed no reaction. I spent each day feeling as if my heart would break from worry. All I could do was visit Robert in the hospital between household chores, hoping and praying for his recovery. But despite my hopes, a few days later, Robert passed away without ever regaining consciousness. In his final moments, his expression was peaceful, almost as if he were asleep, with his usual kindness radiating from his face. During one of my usual visits, Robert's condition suddenly changed, and I was able to be there for his final moments. At least he didn't have to pass away alone, and that was my one small comfort after all the kindness he had shown me. While Robert was unconscious, Susan rarely came to the hospital. However, after learning of his passing, she rushed over in a panic. She stood there, expressionless, almost like a statue. It was understandable. The sorrow of losing a partner after so many years together is unimaginable. At that moment, I couldn't think of the right words to say. After gathering my thoughts, I managed to say, "Robert fought hard until his end. He has such a peaceful expression." Right after I said that, I heard Susan start laughing. I couldn't believe my ears. In the quiet hospital room, with a somber atmosphere surrounding Robert as he lay peacefully, Susan's loud laughter echoed.
People's lives end so easily, don't they?
Despite losing her husband, her words were detached, as if she were talking about someone else's loss. It was hard to believe, but she almost looked happy, smiling brightly. I was shocked by Susan's reaction. Bill rushed back home upon hearing the news, and we shared in our grief. But there was barely time to mourn as his funeral preparations quickly got underway. Throughout the service, I was overwhelmed with sadness. Bill also seemed lost, as if he couldn't accept saying goodbye. During the funeral, I glanced over at Susan and saw her quietly crying. What was that laughter in the hospital? It's like she's a different person. She shed tears for her late husband. What seemed like a natural sight felt oddly unsettling to me. As the funeral neared its end and all the relatives had gathered, Susan, who had been crying until now, suddenly spoke up.
Everyone, listen to me. Catherine, as a daughter-in-law, was having an affair with Robert.
Her shocking accusation, delivered in a frenzied voice, turned every eye in the room toward me. For a moment, I couldn't process what was happening, and my mind went blank. When I realized what she was saying, I hurriedly denied it, shocked by her claim. No, I would never do such a thing. I protested to Susan, but she continued her accusations undeterred.
She has her own room, yet she insisted on staying in Robert's room. What do you all think? It's unthinkable for a daughter-in-law to live in the same room as him.
Susan didn't mention that she was the one who had driven me out of my room. Instead, she accused me, crying hysterically as if she were the victim. I was taken aback by her act. Yet, the relatives seemed to believe her tearful accusations. At this rate, I would end up as the only one seen as the bad person. Just then, Bill, who had been listening silently, raised his voice.
It was Mom who was having the affair.
The entire room fell into murmurs at Bill's words.
What proof do you have?
Susan's tears stopped immediately, and her eyes began darting around nervously. Bill calmly reached into his jacket pocket, took something out, and tossed it high into the air. Photos. It looks like there are 2 people in them. I was speechless as I looked at the photos scattered on the floor. In them, Susan was seen walking beside a much younger man. The relatives, seeing what was in the photos, began murmuring in shock. Amid the tense, uncomfortable atmosphere, Susan turned pale and scrambled on the floor to hide the photos.
Don't look at them. Don't touch them.
Seeing her like that, I almost felt sorry for her. As I wondered why these photos existed, Bill began explaining. I had recently told him how Susan was often away from the house during the day, leaving me to struggle with meal preparations. Since Susan hadn't been one to go out frequently, Bill found it suspicious and hired a detective to look into it. He discovered Susan's affair and had been gathering evidence, intending to confront her at some point. Knowing what Susan was capable of, even during the funeral, he had brought the photos just in case they'd be needed. Bill continued, addressing the relatives, who were clearly unsettled by these revelations.
Actually, Catherine has been handling all the caregiving and housework perfectly on her own for the past 7 years. Because my mom insisted on not hiring any help, Catherine sacrificed herself every day to get it all done. And yet, my mom treated her terribly. She would make unreasonable complaints about everything Catherine did, hurl insults at her, and even went so far as to scatter used diapers in the yard or throw away the food Catherine prepared just because she didn't like her. It's awful, isn't it?
The people listening were silent, holding their breath.
Despite all her efforts, my mom forced Catherine out of her room and told her to sleep in the hallway. That's why she was staying in my dad's room.
Hearing this, tears welled up in my eyes. Over our phone calls, I hadn't gone into too much detail, wanting to keep him from worrying, but he had understood my situation so well. Most of all, I was grateful he was standing up for me in front of everyone. His willingness to protect me, even against his own mother, showed a depth of love I could hardly describe, and in such a difficult time, Bill's support was my greatest comfort.
If you still don't believe me, will you listen to this?
Bill then pulled out a voice recorder. He played it quietly. Everyone in the room leaned in to listen. From the voice recorder, Susan's angry insults and harsh words directed at me played out. Hearing the abuse I had endured daily, I wanted to cover my ears. I remember this moment. As memories flooded back, my heart tightened painfully. Then, with a sudden click, the recording stopped.
Do you really think someone as hardworking and family-oriented as Catherine would be having an affair with my dad? Even after hearing this, will you still believe my mom?
He then played the next recording.
What a burden you've become with that body of yours. I wish you would just.
The vile words kept coming, each more shocking than the last. It turned out that Susan hadn't just targeted me. She had also been hurling cruel and unthinkable insults at Robert. How could she say such things to him, after all the years they spent together, and the life Robert worked so hard to provide? Thinking of Robert enduring such harsh words, I felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow for him. It seemed I wasn't the only one feeling this way. Bill, along with others in the room, had tears welling up in their eyes. The relatives, visibly angry and upset, began to criticize Susan for her actions and words. Some were so furious, they just shook in silence, unable to speak. Thanks to Bill, I was able to clear up the false accusations of infidelity, and the relatives expressed their gratitude and respect for my caregiving.
It's a lie. I never said those things. I haven't done anything wrong.
Susan clung to anyone nearby, desperate for support, but was met only with looks of disdain as they pulled away from her. Her makeup and hair were disheveled, and she looked pitiful. Realizing she had no allies left, she began to wail silently, as if it were the end of the world. Once things had settled down after the funeral and all the commotion, I asked Bill, "You weren't even around. How did you gather so much evidence?"
It was Dad.
To my surprise, Robert had been worried about the situation between Susan and me and had reached out to Bill for help. Together, they had been gathering evidence to support me. It suddenly made sense why they had been in frequent contact. To ensure solid proof, Bill bought a voice recorder when he came home and secretly recorded things. I have no idea where he hid it. But this wasn't the only consequence Susan would face. It seemed that Robert was deeply upset about Susan's behavior toward me. So he discussed it with Bill and arranged for Susan to receive only the minimum legal portion of his inheritance. Robert felt for me, seeing how I continued to take care of the household and caregiving duties every day without neglect, despite everything I endured. Since he couldn't do much physically himself, he kept in contact with Bill and made these arrangements discreetly so Susan wouldn't find out. With Susan being away from the house most of the time, Bill said with a smile, they were able to handle everything smoothly.
By the way, Dad left this for you.
It was a letter from Robert.
Catherine, thank you so much for all the care and attention you've given me.
Those were the first words written in his beautiful handwriting. I began to read the letter aloud for Bill to hear. "I'm sorry about Susan. She's not a bad person. She just can't express herself. I wish I could set her straight, but I can't in my condition. Catherine, you've done everything right." My vision blurred, and I couldn't read the words clearly. He must have endured the frustration of his immobility and the harsh words from Susan. Yet, even in that situation, he thought about both Susan and me. I respected him even more for his kindness. At the end, he wrote what I felt was his true message.
When I'm no longer here, I want you and Bill to do what makes you happy and live freely.
Even in his letter, Robert's warmth and kindness shone through, and I couldn't hold back my tears. After I finished reading, memories flooded over me. The challenging early days of caregiving, the times I grew accustomed to it, the fun days chatting on video calls with Robert and Bill. The nostalgia made my eyes well up again. After some time, Bill said he couldn't forgive Susan for her actions and filed a claim for emotional damages on my behalf for the distress she had caused me. He then declared that he was cutting ties and firmly left the family home. In my heart, I felt some hesitation about leaving an elderly Susan behind. She had said and done so many hurtful things, yet we had lived together like family for such a long time. But Robert's letter gave me the encouragement I needed to put our happiness and freedom first, and with that, I found the resolve to move forward. As for how Susan is doing now, it seems that after leaving all the household chores to me for so many years, she's struggling with even basic tasks like cooking and laundry, and lives miserably alone in a house that has turned into a cluttered mess. She lacks the ability to manage on her own, and with her savings depleted, I can't help but feel a bit sorry for her. On the other hand, our lives have changed completely for the better. Bill took early retirement and, perhaps feeling guilty for all the hardship I endured, has taken on the household chores like a devoted homemaker. His cooking skills have improved so much that he's even quicker than I am these days. Thanks to the inheritance Robert left us, we moved into a new home, and both Bill and I are living comfortably. To my delight, we now have plans to go on a month-long trip abroad together next month. A lot has happened, but I am truly happy now. I'm looking forward to stretching my wings and enjoying our trip, reminiscing about those days we talked excitedly about traveling.